This is your host Sapil Bhartiya, and today we have with us Gordon Hoff, technology advocate at Red Hat. Gordon, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, and today we are going to talk about this state of enterprise report. It's, if I'm not wrong, fourth annual report. Can you tell me what was the goal, or what is the idea behind this report?
This is a survey that this is the fourth year that we've run this. And we ask a lot of questions the same from year to year because we like to track changes. A good example is what percentage of your software is proprietary versus enterprise open source versus community. We also ask questions to track what people are using enterprise open source software for, what they see the benefits are, what they see some of the barriers to using it are. And it just gives us an idea from year to year. Are there changes in the market? Are there things that we should be thinking about? Because it's something becoming a bigger barrier. Maybe we should think about what we can do about that.
What is the goal? Why Red Hat runs this survey and then generates a report?
There's really two things. First of all, there's for our own purposes, sort of understanding what not just technology companies, but enterprise open source users, what do they perceive as being benefits? What do they perceive as being barriers? And from that, we can either, if we really think there is some problem, or we can do something about it. It's also true that there are things, we can sometimes see things, although this is actually much less the case that used to be, where the survey respondents are sort of going, well, open source isn't something. And we're sort of like, no, open source can absolutely do that, but we must just not be getting the message out properly.
This could be kind of either shocking, surprising, or unrealistic. I have been covering open source for almost 15 years now. Initially, the whole idea was education, that why folks should use open source. Fast forward to 2022. Today, almost everybody is using open source. Proprietary software is minuscule. Even if you look at Microsoft or Apple, they are heavy contributor and consumers of open source themselves. Tesla or whoever you name are using. So I don't think there is a challenge of why people should use open source or are they using open source. But I think the problem is shifting more towards, and I may be totally wrong in this, is that how sustainable is that open source? When you're going to use an open source project, should you look at things that, hey, is it backed by a commercial vendor? Is there a community around it? How many users are behind it? Because just because it's open source does not mean that, hey, you know what? It's good to be used. So if I ask you from your perspective, do you also ask these kind of questions to get a better understanding what people are buying?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I said mostly we use the same questions from year to year, but sometimes some question just becomes, oh, that's really not interesting any longer. We get the same answer every year. It's really not telling us anything, or it's not telling consumers of the report something. So one of the new questions we asked last year was, do you care if your vendor contributes to open source? Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I was actually the one that persuaded our research folks to put that question in. And I was sort of expecting kind of a lukewarm response, that, yeah, it's okay if our vendor contributes, but we just care about the product. We don't kind of really care about this ecosystem. And it kind of came back to something like 82% cared. And I was like, wow, I was not expecting that. So one of the questions that we dug in this year was essentially, well, why do you care? And again, I wasn't really sure what we were going to get out of that, but it's really interesting what we get out of that, because there were really like 4 reasons that were all ranked about equal in importance. They do it because it means that the vendor is familiar with open source processes. It means that the vendor can influence development features that they need. And it means that the vendor is going to have more expertise so that they can help us if we have technical problems. And those are all somewhat self-interested, though they also indicate that they kind of understand how open source works to a certain degree. To your point, I don't think you'd have gotten that level of sophistication 10 years ago or something. But then the fourth thing was they help sustain healthy open source communities. And to me, that's, I don't even think that's just an altruistic thing, but they know even if they're an end user company, they're using massive amounts of open source. So I think there's an understanding there that there does need to be a certain giving back, if not directly, on their part. They pay Red Hat, for example, or other open source companies. And yeah, they realize that money needs to get back into the ecosystem somewhere if they're going to still have open source to use, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Right. And I think, once again, you may correct me, that in most cases, people are looking at using that open source. Either open source solves day one problem. Day two is where the real challenge starts, and that's where folks like Red Hat, SUSE, Canonical, whoever you name, they help companies with kind of commercializing, offer support, add features. So back to the point that most companies want to use open source, but they don't have in-house capabilities to manage and maintain. That's why they go. So they do have to ensure that the vendor they are picking has a say, can actually support the project, because they cannot do that. So it's not like, hey, just the way we go and look at anything for a long-term investment, we do see whether the company has any sustainable business around it. So I think that goes, so there's no difference in buying a proprietary versus open source. You do have to look at who is creating that solution, right?
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, and I've seen various other surveys. We didn't ask this question, but that something like 80 or 90% of internal software in enterprises is open source software. So there's very heavy use of open source software there. And so they want ways to know that software is sustainable for their use. And I think the fact that they kind of understand how that works, again, this is not a level of sophistication you'd have seen 10 years ago. You might not have seen it 5 years ago. And I think I think there's always this tension or argument, about, who is doing their fair share and who isn't. But I think there is a general understanding that money does need to flow, back to developers, or developers need to be employed, and that means you're going to have that access to the software in the future. And if money only flows out and effort only flows out of communities to the consumers of what those communities are producing, that's not going to be very healthy. I mean, it might work for a hobby type project, but you're not going to support, you're not going to support by and large major pieces of software with that kind of a model.
Have you also seen any kind of shift in proprietary versus open source adoption? Because now there are a lot of commercial companies. If you look at the whole CNC of Kubernetes space.
Yeah, no, but that's one of the things that we've kind of been tracking. And yeah, this year we asked about, how much of your software is proprietary, how much is enterprise open source, how much is community open source, and where do you see it's going to be 2 years from now? And basically, we see proprietary going down, enterprise open source going up, community going up not quite as quickly as enterprise open source. But there's definitely a continued shift in that regard. You did mention something about kind of sustainability and giving back to communities. One of the interesting trends that we didn't really get into this too much in this survey specifically, but one of the interesting trends you're seeing with under the Linux Foundation, among other places, and things like automotive grade Linux and the Academy Software Foundation, is you're getting more and more of this direct participation by end user companies. And it's not absolutely new. Some of the financial services people came up with AMQP quite a few years ago. But there's definitely more of this direct involvement by the end user companies.
Now, I want to quickly switch the gears and talk about a different problem which is related to open source. And I want to also understand whether that was part of this survey or not, which is security, especially given the geopolitical situation. Cybersecurity is becoming a very, very, interesting topic. Initially, it was like, hey, open source is secure. The fact is, no software is secure. Bugs are part of software development. Misconfiguration are part of when you're deploying something. So it doesn't matter. But it is becoming a very important topic. So in this survey, did you also ask about how much do they care about security and how much role does that play in the decision to go with an open source solution?
We didn't ask the question quite that way. What we did ask them was if they believe enterprise open source is as secure. How does enterprise open source stack up against proprietary software? And again, if you'd asked 10 years ago, particularly when you got out of the largest, most sophisticated enterprises like in financial services and the like, I think you probably get a lot of people. I know we ran focus groups at the time, and you'd be sitting in the other side of the mirror, and somebody would be saying, well, how can it be secure when you can see the source code? And of course that's really not how cyber attacks happen and so forth. By going through the source code and finding some vulnerability, they look for misconfigurations and password of admin or 12345 or whatever. But what you're seeing today is that number has really gone up for the people who say open source is at least as secure as proprietary software. And, they see this as, and really the interesting thing here is that you see the respondents say that it's as secure, more secure, because of actually a lot of the properties that you'd expect to see from a piece of proprietary software. There's well-documented patches are delivered quickly. And enterprise open source software is enterprise software. So we do the things that are needed to provide security. I think to an earlier point about them using enterprise open source software in their own applications. Well, a big benefit of having enterprise open source is that we're not downloading some random software off the internet. We have software that's been well tested that we can use in our applications. And interestingly, I think some of the things that I might call them myths, basically, because the flip side of the question, if went back 10 years ago, is why is open source software more secure? Oh, well, there's lots of eyes in the code. With many eyes, bugs are shallow. Of course, many times there aren't that many eyes on a particular piece of code, and the eyes that are on that code may not be sophisticated enough to audit it for security. So these companies are not really interested, by and large. I mean, some of them are, but it's a smaller number. They don't actually see as big a benefit to auditing the code themselves, or to depending on just lots of unknown eyes to find any problems. They really care about whether their vendor can ensure security.
The adoption of open source is growing across the board, especially when we look at emerging technologies. Did you also find, if there's certain like AI, ML could be there, IoT could be there, that you're seeing adoption of open source emerging technologies as well? And if yes, what are those?
Yeah, I mean, the two biggest areas were clearly AI, ML, and edge IoT. And the way we look at IoT is it's sort of a use case of edge computing. So we for this survey, we kind of grouped them together. And so the open source is increasing there. And I don't think that's terribly surprising. Those are probably the two hottest areas of emerging tech generally. I mean, edge is sort of interesting because actually when I joined Red Hat was when we were doing some of our initial hybrid cloud, starting to roll out some of the hybrid cloud work, and I think at that time there was this sort of perception, or at least certainly a school of thought in some circles, that cloud was just going to become this undifferentiated, essentially the electrical grid applied to computing, and also that if you were one of the big cloud providers, you could sort of game over in terms of the economics, because what enterprise can afford to compete with that? And I think what we've really seen two things is, one is, cloud is, even public clouds is most certainly differentiated from vendor to vendor. How many services does AWS have these days? It's actually very complex and very differentiated, and that's one thing. And the other thing is that it just doesn't make sense to move everything into one centralized location. There's actually all kinds of good reasons why, even if it's not in a data center, that you want your distributed computing to be moving out to the edge and to move out into other locations.
What were some of the key findings of this survey or report?
Well, I think I've talked about some of them. Certainly the security deep dive and the contribution deep dive, I think those are frankly probably the two most interesting things for me. I think another thing that's not a particular surprise, because it comes up in every survey these days, is skills and talent are a problem. And this isn't an open source specific thing. It's something that everybody is struggling with in this area. I think one thing that does imply, though, is that if you have skills and talent as a problem, they're keeping you from doing things, they're a barrier to adopting containers, for example. How much do-it-yourself do you really want to do? I mean, you have business apps that you need in order to differentiate your business. Why, for example, would you want to self-support on a platform if somebody else can do it for you?
Did you also gain any insight into what are the obstacles, what are the things that people worry about, or what kind of things you mentioned? Of course, lack of talent is there. Look at cloud native, complexity is there. When you buy a black box proprietary software, you get one throat to choke. Here you are looking at 5 different vendor, observability is there, monitoring is there, security is there. So let's talk about, did you ask, what are the things that people, hesitate, or they're like worried about it?
We've always put this question in here, what are the barriers that you see? So it's kind of not all, sunshine and puffy clouds. And really what we see as the barriers are the same kind of barriers that you see with software generally. We worry about the inherent security of the code. Well, I worry about the inherent security of the code no matter where the software is coming from. And if you're not worrying about it, what's wrong with you? Because you really should be. And again, the lack of internal skills. And you mentioned the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and I think the Kubernetes ecosystem is really a great example of this, because even if you say, oh, I can handle Kubernetes, how hard can it be? Well, it can probably be a little hard, but okay, so you got that taken care of. How about your CI/CD pipelines? How about your monitoring? How about your logging? How about your distributed tracing? Are you going to integrate all those things themselves? And what happens when a version changes? Is that going to break something? So again, I think there are ways to deal with, I will use the word mitigate as opposed to make them go away, but there are certainly ways that you can mitigate by purchasing a pre-integrated, pre-tested platform.
Gordon, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about the survey. More importantly, share the insights that you gained, that why people are using open source and what are still some obstacles there. And of course, a lot of work is going on. As you mentioned, Linux Foundation, they do a lot of course. All the vendors also do a lot of work to help companies. So thanks for sharing those insights. And I would love to have you back on the show, but not for the fifth report, maybe before that. Thank you.
Okay, sounds great.